There are many literary texts we have read throughout the year that uphold the same theme. In The Tipping Point, The Great Gatsby, A Noiseless Patient Spider, On the Rainy River, and I Have a Dream speech, the theme of isolation is present in all five texts. Isolation is a state of being in a place or a situation that is separate from others.
In the afterword of The Tipping Point, Malcolm Gladwell includes a section called Understanding the Age of Isolation. Gladwell describes how some epidemics occur in their own spaces without influences from the outside world. In this section of the book, he focused on the recent trend of school shootings. These are epidemics in isolation. They follow a mysterious internal script that makes sense only in the closed world that teenagers inhabit. The epidemics of school shootings started following the massacre at Columbine High in Colorado. In the 22 months that followed, there were 19 separate incidents of school violence across the United States. Each of these incidents paralleled the Columbine shootings almost eerily. Although many people claim these acts of violence were a part of a greater wave of violence, this was not the case. At this time, violence between students was down. This shows how those involved in acts of school violence are isolated from other students and other acts of violence. As the isolation of the students involved with the school shootings was not visible until after the acts occurred, Jay Gatsby's social isolation was not fully seen until after his death.
I rang, I wrote, I implored, but not a single one of the sparkling hundreds that enjoyed his hospitality attended the funeral. And from Daisy, not even a flower. I was all he had, the only one who cared.
In The Great Gatsby, Gatsby focused all of his attention on Daisy. He changed his name, moved to a new state, and threw parties every week in hopes of winning Daisy back. In doing so, Gatsby isolated himself by focusing everything on one person who ultimately didn't reciprocate his attention. After Gatsby died, Nick held a funeral for him. After a while, the minister glanced several times at his watch, so I took him aside and asked him to wait for half an hour. But it wasn't any use. Nobody came. From the outside, it looked as if Gatsby had many friends. He had hundreds of people at his parties and had many connections. This was all a facade. Gatsby spent so much time focusing on Daisy that he kept himself from making real connections with others.
In the book, Gatsby was always physically present, but his soul was isolated from the rest of the world. He never let anyone truly get to know who he was, and he gave up his life for Daisy. This relates to the isolation mentioned in A Noiseless Patient Spider by Walt Whitman. The poem first starts talking about a spider and its lonely journey of making a web. It then switches over to talk about the soul and how it's just like a spider. The first five stanzas state, "A noiseless patient spider, I marked where on a little promontory it stood isolated, martel to explore the vacant, vast surrounding. It's launched forth filament, 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 out of itself, ever unreeling them, ever tirelessly speeding them." The poet makes a big deal about how the soul is also cut off from other objects in the outside world. A feeling of isolation is the biggest emotional component of this poem. Rather than his soul being isolated, Tim O'Brien talks about how he was emotionally isolated from his family when he was dealing with his draft notice.
In the short story On the Rainy River, Tim O'Brien is looking back on the time of his life when he was deciding whether to accept his draft notice and go fight in the Vietnam War or flee the country to avoid the war. This was a life-changing decision, yet O'Brien felt pressured to make it on his own. Although he had family he could have talked to about what he should do, he isolated himself emotionally and avoided the topic. This is one story I've never told before. Not to anyone. Not to my parents, not to my brother or sister, not even to my wife. O'Brien fled on a whim, only leaving a brief note for his family. He made himself sick and restless while trying to make his decision. Following his decision, he wouldn't open up about the internal struggle he faced for more than 20 years. He kept himself isolated from his family and friends by withholding how difficult this decision was for him to make, which had lasting physical and psychological effects.
And On the Rainy River, Tim O'Brien covers the emotional aspect of isolation. On the other hand, in this I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King Jr., he covers the social aspect of isolation.
Sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we've come here today.
In Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, he elaborates on what he and other black people go through on a daily basis. He talks about the discrimination between black and white and how people can make a change in that. He states, 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languishing in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. This describes how isolated black people are from others. They are physically and emotionally present in society, but the rest of society isolates them. Whether it's The Tipping Point, The Great Gatsby, On the Rainy River, or the I Have a Dream speech, they all share a common theme. The theme is shown throughout all 5 literary texts, whether it is emotional or social aspect of isolation.